Buckle up, folks. This is going to be a heavy one. This is the case that I knew I would be covering from the day I decided to create this channel. Also, my viewers have spoken. I put up a poll asking what case you wanted to see. This one, by far, was the most requested. The Lafferty brothers. Ron and Dan Lafferty. Arguably the most infamous and likely famous of the Mormon culture themed crimes out there. It's intense. And I also, this was tough for me. This was very tough as a true crime person, as a writer, as everything else, to watch Under the Banner of Heaven, which was the Netflix miniseries based on Jon Krakauer's book about the Lafferty case. Guys, I will do a video just about the show. What is actually Latter-day Saint theology, culture, whatever, where is, and just the pure writing is crap as far as dialogue, which is bizarre because the creator, Dustin Lance Black, grew up LDS. He's also an Oscar winner, and yet this was so poorly written. Anyway, we'll watch that video to hear my ranting on that. But that's what we're going to be talking about, is the grisly case of the Ron and Dan Lafferty, and specifically their victims, Brenda Lafferty, their sister-in-law, and sweet little Erica, 14 months old, Brenda's daughter. It's hairy. It is difficult, and I want to do justice and honor to those victims. And how blaming it on the church is just, it doesn't quite wash. This is True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate, where we enjoy our sweets to try to counteract the bitter of the true crime world. I'm also a woman of faith, which is why I cover a lot of religious-based true crime, and I am an active Latter-day Saint. I am a novelist. I am a USA Today bestseller, and my most recent book is a suspense called Just One More. I've written a whole bunch of other stuff, including a lot of Latter-day Saint themed fiction as well. I will list a bunch of my resources in the description. One that would be fascinating, I recommend watching, is Profiling Evil with Mike King. He is former law enforcement in Utah, and he has worked with and talked to and interviewed Don Lafferty multiple times. He has insights that no one else really has. And I'll be bringing up some of those here. His stuff is so definitely worth watching. And I'll probably drop in bits and pieces about the show in this video, but this video will be primarily focusing on the actual crimes. Ron and Dan Lafferty were brothers, and they came from a family of at least 8 children. There were 6 boys and at least 2 sisters. They were living in American Fork, Utah, which you probably have heard of if you're following true crime at all. There's a Ruby Frankie connection. There's Lori Vallow connections. There's all kinds of weird. So many cases weirdly show up in American Fork, Utah. So it is about 35 miles or so south of Salt Lake City and about 20-ish miles north of Provo, which is where Brigham Young University is. That kind of gives you an idea of where American Fork is located. When these crimes happened, July 1984, American Fork was, I think, if I recall correctly, was somewhere in the ballpark of about 13 to 18,000 people. It wasn't that large of a city. It has since grown quite a bit, although it's kind of landlocked. It can't grow out anymore, but there are more and more people coming in. I think it's probably at least 35,000 people today. You may recognize parts of the city because in addition to so Footloose was actually filmed in parts of American Fork, as well as the next door city to the west, Lehigh, and Payson, which is in about 50 miles or so south. Ron and Dan grew up in a very unusually strict home with some unusual beliefs. Their father was a chiropractor and didn't believe in regular medicine. One of the boys apparently accidentally shot himself with an arrow on a Sunday, and because it was the Sabbath, they couldn't go see a doctor. And so he could have bled to death internally. I don't think it was that serious, but they didn't go to the ER. To be clear, Latter-day Saints do believe in getting medical treatment from regular doctors and on Sunday. In fact, I went into labor and gave birth on a Sunday, and I had no qualms whatsoever going to the hospital. And my doctor, was active Latter-day Saint as well, showed up in his suit. So that's not a problem, guys. This is according to Mike King. before they would pray over everything. You know, the scriptures say pray always. They took that so literally that sometimes it would be on the way to the grocery store, should we turn left or right? You know, which route should we take today? Just weird stuff like that. And their mother, Claudine, their father was Watson in the show. He's named Ammon, which is a very Mormon-y name. His real name was Watson. But Claudine, their mother, she would hold a needle on a thread above the food, the dinner table, and watch it apparently swing or make some sort of sign as to what food it was safe to eat or what they should eat first. So there's some weird things. And then there's other stuff like, at one point, part of this is shown in the show, but it's misattributed to punishing the boys for not doing their chores properly. In reality, the mom and dad Lafferty got into a fight, and dad took out his anger on the family dog with a baseball bat until its demise. This is the kind of man he was. Ron and Dan, as they both married, had kids, whatever. Something else that Ron would do that was odd, and so instead of mushing up food with a fork or buying baby food or whatever, he would eat food, chew it up into a mash into his mouth, and feed it to his child with his own mouth. Again, this is according to Mike King of Profiling Evil. Creepy, weird stuff. They created their own religion on the side, secretly not letting the regular mainstream church members know what they were doing. They called it a training academy, and they did call it, and this title does show up in the show, called the School of the Prophets. Now watch my other video, I'll get to that, to why that's, they handle it weird in the show, because that is an actual term from church history. There was a school for men that Joseph Smith put together back in the day, and they did Greek and Hebrew, so they could read the scriptures in the original. So the School of the Prophets did exist in the 1830s with Joseph Smith, but they created their own version, and they were teaching all kinds of weird things, and it was their own little religion. So then they started believing that all the laws of the United States were not valid and should not be obeyed. Forget the fact that laws help keep things at least somewhat civilized, right? They stopped obeying. In the show, it's like, we don't pay our taxes. And that was real. They also would take their own trash to the dump, which, okay, fine, you do you, whatever. They lived off the grid as much as possible, which is easier in 84, 83. This is the years leading up to it. But they would even, like, not obey traffic lights. Like, those are there literally for just basic public safety. That's benefits you too, guys. At one point, Ron ran for city council and won, terrifyingly. Later, again, he's ranting against the law. He ran for county sheriff. Fortunately, did not win, but he was railing against both the government and the LDS Church. So he was very much against anything, wanting to give any sort of structure or control to his life, and he didn't appreciate that. So he was bringing his brothers into it as well. So it's unclear just how much the other brothers knew about what was going to happen later. We know for sure Dan kind of just drank the Kool-Aid of Ron. In the show, that makes it sound like their father ruled with an iron fist the entire extended family and then passed that to Ron. I don't get the impression that that was the case in real life, but Ron did have this influence over his brothers, and at least Dan. But even Alan, who was the husband of Brenda, he was attending these meetings, at least for a while. Question marks, let's just put it that way. Brenda started realizing the kinds of weird things her husband Alan was learning and studying and discussing, and she goes, I am not feeling comfortable with this. I think you need to stop meeting with your brothers. No more of this School of the Prophets training academy thing, no more. That was not great. That was the last straw, and that's what put her basically into the sights of Ron and Dan to get rid of her. Prior to that, both Dan and Ron's wives had said, you guys are going off the deep end. We're filing for divorce. So they had filed papers, but it appears that Ron thought, okay, he blamed the end of his marriage on Brenda because Brenda supported his wife in leaving him. And I just side note, I could not find her name. The show calls her Diana. And if I would have really looked harder than I did, I probably could have found her name. But I'm assuming because her name isn't out there easily, she doesn't want to be identified. So I'm not even going to try. But Ron's now ex-wife, Brenda, was like, yeah, and Dawn's wife too. Both of them had filed for divorce, and Brenda was like, "You go, girls. That's smart." So when then Alan was then forbidden to come, that Ron was not cool with that. And so Brenda, he viewed Brenda. This is according to Brenda's two living sisters who have spoken to the media relatively recently when the show came out in 2022. That no, that was the last straw. He blamed Brenda for the breakup of their families. He blamed Brenda for losing. Now his brothers are going to be falling apart because Alan can't come to these meetings anymore. And that is what led to, unfortunately, Brenda and her baby daughter being taken. In the meantime, though, Dan and Ron were excommunicated from the church. I want to say it was somewhere in 1982-ish ballpark. It was hard to find a clear date on that, but the show makes it sounds like it was right up to the events, or it was more being threatened. And when the church realized that one of the brothers was trying to marry his 14-year-old stepdaughter into a polygamous marriage, the church was like, yeah, nope, you're then excommunicated them both. So they were excommunicated well before the big events. One really chilling thing that Mike King brings up is a recording that was found of a phone call of Brenda talking to one of the sisters-in-law, I don't know which one, but she said, "Is she aware that her life is in jeopardy?" And it was Brenda who ended up losing her life and her baby girl. Ron declares that he is the voice of the Lord. He is a prophet, the voice of the Lord, and Dan is the arm of the Lord, which tells you then who did what. That Dan was basically, he was the one doing the actions that Ron would command. March of 1984, that is when we get the list, as people call it, or the quote-unquote revelation, supposedly God telling Ron and Dan that Brenda and little baby Erica, as well as Chloe Lowe and Richard Stowe, also all had to be quote-unquote removed. March of 1984 is when that came about, so they started planning it in March, and then it happened on July 24th, which in Utah is a state holiday. It's Pioneer Day, that it commemorates the day that the pioneers and Brigham Young first arrived in Salt Lake Valley after crossing the plains and being driven out of home after home. And ironically, many saints actually had arrived days prior and were already plowing for crops and all of that. But that was the day that Brigham Young himself showed up. So he decided that was when the holiday would be. It happened on Pioneer Day, which I think is intentional. That they picked that day because it had some sort of church history significance to them. So a couple of weeks before, early July, they met two new, quote-unquote friends, acquaintances, Ricky and Carnes. Forgetting all of their last names, their full names. But they were part of the driving getaway vehicle stuff. The other four brothers, again, were not directly involved, but again, it's unclear how much they knew. However, we know that one brother pushed back on the idea of killing both a sister-in-law and a baby, but saying, "Well, do you really have to kill a baby? Aren't babies innocent?" But there was no word on if there was pushback on killing her mother. What? And to that, Ron replied, showed him a knife, and said it would be used to remove the wicked in the last days. Explain to me how a 14-month-old child is wicked. That's no. Not in LDS doctrine, or as far as I know, any doctrine. No. So the day of, they strapped a cooler to the top of this green station wagon that they have. It's like a luggage rack at the top with supplies because it was going to be a long day. First, they went to their mother's house, Claudine, and they got a sawed-off shotgun, or they got a shotgun and sawed off the end. Brought a bunch of other guns, though they planned to use them only toward police if they needed to. Because according to Ron, guns are good for, quote, cops. Oh, lassie. But he kept insisting that a blade is what had to be done for their future victims, because it had to be like an Abrahamic sacrifice. Now, here's an interesting thing, just a little side note with the LDS doctrine, that we believe, and I believe this fits with most other Christian denominations, that Jesus Christ gave the ultimate sacrifice, and that the Old Testament blood sacrifices of animals were supposed to be symbolic of that ultimate sacrifice. And so once Christ did that, we no longer have to do animal sacrifices. So if supposedly Ron and Dan believed in the LDS doctrines, animal sacrifice wouldn't be a thing anymore. Blood sacrifice wouldn't be a thing. But they don't make sense. So, that's where we are. On that same day, Alan goes off to do work, which is odd in a couple of ways. One, he was his own boss. He had his own tiling business, so he could do his own hours. Two, he knew that his brothers were planning on hurting his wife at some point, and soon. And three, the job he took that day was 70-ish miles to the north in Ogden. The show says Sandy, which is about actually half that length. It's much closer. Very strange that he would leave knowing his wife might be in danger, and he could have pushed off that job to another time. Very odd to me. Apparently he called Brenda at 1:30 p.m. Actually said, "What are you wearing?" which is a weird thing. Didn't strike me as the kind of guy that would have like cutesy, sexy talk over the phone, but okay. Then he has to talk to the baby. And it's an hour later that Ron and Dan left their mother's home at 2:30 p.m. The timing seems odd to me, that maybe Alan knew something. Also, later Alan admitted that early that morning, 2:30 in the morning, he woke up Brenda to have some intimate time, and that was not usual for them to do something in the middle of the night like that. So part of me, it's just wonders did Alan suspect that maybe this was the last day for her? Did he know? I don't think we'll ever know, but that's upsetting to me. But Ron and Dan, they leave their mother's house. They have all of these weapons. They pull into Alan's driveway where Brenda, Alan, and Erica live. And they go up to their front door. They leave the two other guys, Ricky and Carnes, in the car. Ron bangs on the door. Brenda doesn't answer. That is not shown in the show. They condensed a bunch of stuff. They drive away. Ron's not driving. I think it might be Ricky Knapp who's driving, but Ron snaps. He says, "Snap! So stop! Go back. We need to do it." So they go back. Actually, according to my King quote, he said, "The hell with it. I feel like doing it. I feel good about it." So they go back again. They pound on the door again. This time, Brenda she comes to the door, doesn't open it all the way, but she says, "I can't let you in." But now they know she's inside. They break down the door, and now they're inside. Brenda fights, and she is heard screaming, "Please stop. I promise I won't do it again. And please don't hurt my baby." They beat her till she's unconscious. Now, this is where the show takes some timetable liberties, and I don't know why, because it's horrifying enough. I don't know why they changed it. Once she was unconscious, they wrapped a vacuum cord around her neck. Then Dan went into the baby's room, where I'll see if I can stomach showing part of Dan actually describing what he did. But it sounds like according to him later, he says that he believed that Erica thought that he was her father. And apparently they had similar voices, and as brothers, they may have looked similar, which makes it even more doubly sad. He claims that he told her, "I don't know why I have to do this, but it's time for you to go back to heaven. Maybe we can talk about it on the other side someday." And then, according to him, he closed his eyes and turned his head away and drew the blade, and then didn't look back. And then he also said he wasn't sure he had actually done it all the way. But then he saw the blood on his knife, and he went, "Oh, okay, I must have. I didn't imagine that." So he rinsed it off. Then he goes and finds a Brenda who, fortunately, is unconscious. He took care of Brenda as well. He rinsed off his knife again, and they go out the back door. There were also reports from like the next door neighbor and whatnot saying that the windows and whatnot were shaking for what was going on in the inside, and they heard screaming, including the baby screaming for her mommy. Now, Dan says that the baby was calm, but that seems to be completely counter to what neighbors reported hearing. Maybe she calmed down when she saw him, thinking it was her dad, which to me is just an additional horrific betrayal. The video that Mike King has of Dan describing the crime is just so It's like he might as well have been describing a trip to the grocery store. It is just that matter of fact. To this day, he doesn't find it. There's no regret. There's no remorse. He says, I can't repent from something that's not wrong. God told me to do this. I was supposed to. Bizarre and horrifying. Ron actually tells Dan, hey, thanks for taking care of the baby. I couldn't have done that. And Dan goes, yeah, no problem. Their brains. They get in the car, they drive away. The next victim on the list was supposed to be Chloe Lowe, a former Relief Society president who had been supporting Ron's wife in leaving him. So Relief Society is the women's organization at church, and the Relief Society president is, I mean, not only is she the person who was watching out for all the women in the ward and making sure their families are okay, but she's the top female leader in any congregation. She knows what's going on, whatever, if there's financial issues and a family needs help with getting food or paying rent or whatever it may be, she's the one who's going to know. And she apparently was supporting Ron's wife in leaving and filing papers. And so, of course, she must be to blame for destroying his family, as Brenda was. So apparently they thought that Chloe Lowe was a small, weak little woman and that they would take care of her quite easily. In the show, it makes it sound like the entire Lowe family was targeted, and they don't really explain why. She had a home alarm system, which to me, that was highly unusual in '84. I mean, I didn't know anyone who had a family alarm system. In the early 90s, I knew some people who had motion detector lights, and that was about it. But she had an alarm system, which tells me she probably knew that her life was in danger. They cut the wires, though, of the home alarm system, but she wasn't home, thank goodness. She wasn't home. So they trashed the place, took some cash and some petty things because they were all hopped up from the first crime scene. And then they get back in the car and they plan to go to the home of Richard Stowe. He is the stake president. So for those who don't know, a stake is a geographical group of wards, which are congregations. So you have wards as the smaller one, larger one, and that encompasses many wards as a stake. I've heard it being compared to a Catholic diocese sort of thing. So he was the stake president who was the one that presided over the meeting the council that would have excommunicated Ron. So again, one more person that Ron blames for bad things happening to him. But of course, he says that God is the one who put them on the list, not him. So driving along, though, they pass the place to turn. And they go, oh, well, okay, we missed his street. That must not be the day to do one more. So I guess we're done for today. Maybe we need to get some more money or whatever. And thank heavens. They decided to drive to Reno in Nevada. And that is where they were arrested eventually a few days later in a buffet line, not in some big, huge, dramatic thing, which of course they have to do for the show. But yeah, they were arrested in a buffet line in Reno in a casino. So that's great. In the show, they also show him, Ron trying to kill Dan. But that's in a restroom at the casino in Reno. In reality, what happened is they were in jail in cells next to each other. And at the time, the cells weren't separated by walls. They were separated by bars, side to side. And so Ron, being in one cell, he tells Dan, well, God has told me that I'm supposed to kill you. And then Dan goes, well, I'm going to have to pray about that one to see what I think about it. Like, excuse me. And then Ron's like, well, and if I were to do it, let me show you how I would do it. Oh, come here. So he coaxes Dan to the bars with his back to him. And he throws a towel around Dan's neck and pulls in an attempt to cut off his airway and remove his life from him. And Dan goes completely unconscious, collapses. He remembers passing out thinking, okay, this is it. I'm gone. I'm dead. But he regained consciousness to see his brother in the other cell sobbing. And at first he's thinking, oh my goodness, my brother feels bad for trying to do this to me. No, I think he was crying because he didn't accomplish it. So he goes, let's try again. Let's try again. And Dan was like, oh, no, not even, dude. Starts just cussing him out and said, I'm never speaking to you again. And he never did. He never spoke to his brother again. They did some news conference type things before all that, but when Ron tried to off his own brother, Dan was like, "No, not doing that." And yet he still thinks that he was supposed to kill Brenda and Erica. So what? Ron told you to do these things, and the same man who told you to do these horrific things just tried to kill you. You're pissed about that. But the other things he said is still okay and right. It makes no sense whatsoever, and it's just it's beyond disturbing. He let his hair grow, his beard. They were already having long beards in the show. It makes it sound like they say Book of Mormon men, and I was like, try Old Testament. Like Book of Mormon, I mean, there's no beards I can even really think of being mentioned. It's not really a thing. But even in the paintings that have been done, if it's an older prophet, he might have a beard. If it's a younger prophet, he's probably clean shaven. It's not really a thing. So it's kind of weird the way they phrased it. But Dan grew, they both had long beards when they were arrested. Dan just never cut his until about 5 or so years ago. Then he felt like he had a revelation. He should cut his hair and his beard. So he did. And then he decided to grow it back. So, okay, Dan. So the brothers go to trial. Dan's situation is pretty clear cut. He's convicted. He's given 2 concurrent life sentences without the chance of parole. Ron is, as the mastermind of the whole thing, is given the DP. We'll call it for platform purposes. I always thought it was interesting that he got the DP, but Dan did not, when Dan's the one who did the horrific stuff. Yes, it was Ron's thinking, and he was the brain behind it, but I would think that Dan would have qualified for that too. Dan calls his cell his monastery. That's where he ponders and prays and thinks he gets revelation. He thinks he is the prophet Elijah returned, that the walls of the prison will fall and he will then step forward as the prophet Elijah. Dan has talked about how he gets revelation. He says, the way Moses did, from a burning bush, and then he mimes marijuana, like weed, and then he kind of smiles. I'm like, okay. He quotes scripture, but apparently after he was arrested, he tore up his scriptures in a rage, but he's still quoting them. I would say this makes no sense again and again. It doesn't, but we're trying to make sense of something that you can't make sense of. In 1991, however, Ron's conviction was overturned because supposedly some appellate court said that they didn't adequately look into his competency to stand trial in the original case, even though he had been sent to the Utah State Hospital, which is a mental hospital, to be evaluated, and they had declared him sane or at least competent to stand trial in 1985. So even though they had done that, and the court said that, they didn't look enough into his competency, so it was overturned and they retried him. It sounds like the competency arguments were based on his attempt to off his brother and a couple of attempts to off himself. Now, those things wouldn't, I'm not a lawyer, psychologist, forensic, whatever, I'm none of that. These are all of my opinions, but my understanding of things, I don't think that attempting to off your accomplice or yourself would be grounds for incompetency today. The bar is pretty low for competency. You need to just know what's going on, know what's considered illegal, be able to know what's happening in the courtroom, all simple things like that. Eventually, the 4th District Court found he was incompetent after it was, the whole thing was overturned. They sent him to the state hospital to restore his competency. 3 years later, he's found competent and he's retried. 1996, he's reconvicted, resentenced with the same sentence. During his retrial, he starts swearing all over the judge. He wore a sign on the back of his pants that said "exit only," reportedly because he was afraid that evil spirits would try to enter him through there. But a piece of paper saying "exit only" would prevent that? You are the weirdest. Okay. Eventually, his appeals got exhausted, and he chose, of the options in Utah at the time, it was lethal injection or firing squad. He picked firing squad. He was then supposed to be executed in sometime in 2020. I have not seen an actual date as far as any initial date that was set. I suspect that it would have been postponed beyond that because of the pandemic, how that put a wrench into everything. But unfortunately, on the 11th of November 2019, he died of natural causes in prison. That Dan is still behind bars, and I can't imagine that will ever change. He will die there. A couple of thoughts from Brenda's sisters. Two of her sisters. I don't know how many siblings Brenda had, but two sisters who have spoken: Betty McIntyre and then Sharon Weeks. So Betty has said, Alan, referring to Brenda's husband, Alan, saying he's the one who let her down. He should have taken care of her that day. I have a hard time not thinking that he knew something. And from what little I know, I agree. Sharon, the other sister, who has spoken to the press, said, quote, religion had nothing to do with the reason Brenda and Erica were murdered. I guess you have to go through the court process and listen to the prosecutor tell the story about why it wasn't a religious killing, why Ron Lafferty was not incompetent, and how the crimes were determined to be a crime of passion, murders of revenge, and it had nothing to do with religion. So, and the more I've looked into it, I think as far as Ron is concerned, I 100% agree. I think that it was revenge and anger, and he wanted control, and he was pissed off at not being able to have control and be this important person. As far as Dan is concerned, I think there was a religious component for him. That's just my opinion, because he seems to still think that even offing a little child was okay. Sharon Weeks, Brenda's sister, speaking. This is to the Deseret News when the Banner of Heaven came out. She said, talking about her sister, she said she wanted to be the next Diane Sawyer. And then she talks about how the scene in the show where there's a BYU broadcasting professor locks her in a studio and then tries to take advantage of her. But it's total fiction. Not that all women get passes at some point in their lives, but that never happened to her sister. And she loved her professors and loved her experience at BYU. And she said if he had done that, Brenda's reaction would not have been this weak, oh my goodness, I must escape. It would have been like fighting the crap back. You are not doing this to me, dude. The Brenda in the show, here's my little tiny review, is that the actors did an amazing job with what they were given. Andrew Garfield especially, amazing job. The problem is the writing was crap. And it was so inaccurate on so many levels. And yes, watch that video. It's coming, I promise. Oh my gosh. But yeah, she said she would have punched somebody. She wouldn't have sat there calmly and talked to somebody if she felt threatened. Just that there's not to say that women don't have negative experiences at BYU or other institutions, but then says, quote, but it didn't happen to her. That did not happen to Brenda. So a couple of weird things that Dan has said from prison relatively recently. He said, I don't feel comfortable saying I know I'm Elijah, but I'd be pretty surprised if I'm not. It's never haunted me. It's never bothered me. I don't blame anyone for not understanding it, but if you had done it, it wouldn't haunt you either. It's a strange phenomenon. A really important element about this case is the justification that the Laffertys used, and Chad and Lori and a bunch of other cases that have been in the LDS sphere in the US in recent years. They cite Nephi killing Laban in the Book of Mormon as an excuse, and see, they point to that as the justification. Like, see, that when sometimes God can say you can kill someone. I mentioned this during Chad's trial, but I think it's important to bring up again for those, especially if you haven't seen that video. If in context, and this is, I'm not trying to convert or proselytize or whatever, to clarify our beliefs and where they intersect. In the Book of Mormon, in the story where Nephi is a young man, his father's a prophet, they're like, oh, well, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, you have to leave, da da da. And the family flees to the wilderness, and then Nephi is told, you and your brothers need to go back and get the record, the scriptural record that's on these brass plates. And Laban has them, this rich dude who's a relative and has all this influence or whatever. And Nephi and his brothers try several times, trying to buy them or whatever, and then Laban keeps either trying to steal their stuff or tries to kill them, whatever. And then Nephi's like, well, I'm just going to go in and try to figure it out, and maybe God will direct me. And then he sees Laban passed out on the ground, drunk, and that's when the spirit comes to him. He gets this intense thought, basically saying is from God, that I'm supposed to kill him. And he's like, whoa, no, which is the first step. Like, Ron and Dan and Lori and Chad never went, no, wait, what, no. Nephi did not want to kill anyone. He says, I've never killed anyone. I don't want to kill anyone. But the Spirit said, it's much better for one person to die than an entire civilization, basically, a whole civilization to perish without an unbelief. So you need basically, the scriptures mattered. So your children can read and understand the scriptures and whatever else. It was essentially, those were the stakes. It was one person versus an entire civilization. Thousands of people. And I would point out also, not only was it just a matter of like ratio of like, literally the greater good, but there are many times after this event. That event happens in the first couple chapters of the Book of Mormon. And then there's like the rest of Nephi's life. Many times where his life is in danger. Even by his own brothers. They tried to kill him and all kinds of other things. And never again does he use murder he never again kills. Never again. Even when his own life is in danger, even when his family's lives are in danger. Never again. It was that one time ever, and he had plenty of opportunities. If that was a valid excuse, oh, God made me do it, Nephi would have used that excuse multiple times, and he didn't. So anytime someone brings up Nephi and Laban, he says, you have to ask two questions. Number one, what was the person's response to thinking, I'm supposed to kill this person? God told me to. Is it, holy crap, no, I don't want to do that? Because it should be. And two, what are the stakes? Is it, oh, this is one bad person that has hurt someone's feelings, or is this in my way? Or are we talking, like, if someone could go back in time and get rid of Hitler, that would save millions of people. Like, that type of thing. So if those two things don't stand up, that's not even the Nephi Laban situation is not an excuse. Period. The end. So that is the gist of the case of the Lafferty brothers. That's some heavy stuff. And shake some of this off and think of Brenda and little Erica, because they were remarkable, and little Erica didn't even have a chance to have much of a life, and that is the tragedy. All of that. If you stick around with this long, I really appreciate it. Like the video, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, go get yourself some chocolate. Now I will make another video where I rant about the actual show and all the bizarre, stupid things that they got so freaking wrong.